Good morning. Welcome to our Bible study this morning. This morning we'll be looking at 1 Corinthians chapter 7 verses 10 through 16. 1 Corinthians chapter 7 verses 10 through 16. Especially this morning we'll be looking at what the Bible means when it describes a married person departing from their marriage. Here in 1 Corinthians 7, 10 through 16, we find that Paul is writing about a person who's married departing from that marriage. Listen to what's said. And unto the married I command, yet not I, but the Lord, let not the wife depart from her husband. But and if she depart, let her remain unmarried, or be reconciled to her husband. And let not the husband put away his wife. But to the rest speak I, not the Lord. If any brother hath a wife that believeth not, and she be pleased to dwell with him, let him not put her away. And the woman which hath an husband that believeth not, and if he be pleased to dwell with her, let her not leave him. For the unbelieving husband is sanctified by the wife, and the unbelieving wife is sanctified by the husband. Else were your children unclean, but now are they holy. But if the unbelieving depart, let him depart. A brother or sister is not under bondage in such cases, but God hath called us to peace. For what knowest thou, O wife, whether thou shalt save thy husband, or how knowest thou, O man, whether thou shalt save thy wife? Okay, in these verses you can see there's a whole lot of teaching concerning marriage and the idea of the responsibilities of the wife toward the husband and vice versa. When a spouse leaves their marriage, is that an acceptable grounds for divorce? So there's many different things involved in these verses. We're not going to be looking at all these teachings. It would take forever to get through them this morning. The one thing I wanted to center on is, what do these verses mean when they describe one partner in the marriage union departing from that marriage? That's what I believe is important. You can see that in verse number 10, and let not the wife depart from her husband. You can see it in verse 11. But and if she depart, let her remain unmarried. You can also see the word depart used again down in verse number 15. And if the unbelieving depart, let him depart. A brother or sister is not in bondage unto such cases. Okay, so you can see the word depart is used several different times during the course of these verses. There's a lot of discussion and there's a lot of different ideas involved with what departing means. So what I would like to do simply for today is look at what this word or what the phrase, what the term depart means in the context of 1 Corinthians 7 verses 10 through 16. Now before we get started, let me remind you, especially based on what verse number 15 says, if the unbelieving depart, let him depart. A brother or sister is not under bondage in such cases. Based on what that verse says, the best that I can understand these verses, and I believe what the Bible says, is this. Departing, whatever that means, when one person departs from a marriage, the remaining spouse is no longer under the bondage of the marriage covenant. In other words, they're free to divorce and they're free to remarriage. That's how I would understand verse 15. So that's why this term departing is so important. If a spouse departs from their marriage, and if that leaves the other marital partner not under bondage, departure therefore is a scriptural grounds for divorce. Departure is a scriptural grounds for divorcing and also for allowing remarriage. So that's why this is an important issue. Whatever Paul means by depart here will help us to understand one of the scriptural grounds for divorce. Okay, so let's study that word depart very quickly. That word depart comes from a Greek word that's used several different times in the New Testament. What I would like to do is give you a list of the 6 different ways that the word depart is used in the New Testament. Now keep in mind, we're talking about the Greek word for depart. It's translated to sunder. It's translated to depart. It's translated to separate. So in these different verses that I give you, you may find it translated sunder, depart, or separate, but it's always the same Greek word. By looking at the different ways this Greek word for depart is used in the New Testament, it helps us to come to an understanding of what the word depart actually means. Now that word depart is translated sunder in Matthew 19 and also in Mark 10. In that case, it's talking about sundering a marriage. And in the context, the idea is this. A marriage is a covenant made, a promise made, an agreement made, a contract made between the two, the couple, the two people that are united in marriage. They have a covenant between them. The husband promises his wife he'll do certain things. The wife promises she'll do certain things for the husband. That's the marital covenant. In the context of Matthew 19 and in Mark chapter 10, as you read and as you find the word sunder there, you're going to find that what's being talked about is this. It's the breaking of that covenant, the separation of the two individuals that took part in the covenant. Now you might ask, well, how does God fit into all this? Keep in mind, God is the witness to the covenant that's made between the husband and the wife. So the husband and the wife, they make promises to each other. That forms the marital covenant. God is the witness to that covenant. He'll hold us accountable to keep that covenant. It goes on in Matthew 19 and Mark 10 to describe the idea it's possible to sunder that covenant. Okay, to break it apart, to separate the two people that made this covenant. So there, the Greek word for departure is translated sunder. It means to separate the two parties of the covenant, or to sunder the marital agreement. Okay? In Acts 1 and also in Acts 18, we find this Greek word for departure used to describe departing from a physical location. It talks about Paul departing from the different cities that he was visiting as a missionary. He would depart and go to another city. So in Acts 1 and in Acts 18, the idea behind this Greek phrase for departure means to separate from a physical location, like to leave a town. That is another idea behind depart. In Romans 8, we find again that same Greek word being used for depart. There it talks about us not being able to be separated from the love of Christ. So in the context of Romans 8, what does the Greek word for depart mean? It means just to be separated from something. In that case, to be separated from an emotion. The emotion of love that God has placed upon us. And it's impossible for us to be separated from that love. In 1 Corinthians 7, that's the verses we just looked at the beginning of our study. There, of course, is talking about departure from a marriage. In Philemon chapter 1, or in the entire book of Philemon, it only has one chapter in it. In the entire book of Philemon, we find that same Greek word being used. There it's talking about a slave named Onesimus that departs from the slave owner Philemon. And Paul is trying to bring the two back together again. Now let me just try to explain this very quickly. Even though Onesimus the slave did physically depart from Philemon, even though he left him physically and ran off, that's not really the issue that Paul is talking about in Philemon. He's talking about the fact that Onesimus, who was a servant of Philemon, he ran off from his responsibilities. He ran off from his obligations. He ran off from Philemon not only physically, but also he ran off from the obligations that he had concerning the agreement he had with Philemon. He was Philemon's servant. He didn't fulfill his responsibilities. He ran off. And so Paul is asking Philemon to accept Onesimus back because Onesimus ran away from his responsibilities. Think of it this way. If Philemon had sent Onesimus on an errand to go to another city to do an errand for Philemon, there wouldn't have been any issue at all. It wasn't the matter that Onesimus physically left Philemon. The issue was Onesimus departed from the responsibilities Philemon had given to him. That's what the real issue was in Philemon. So when we look at the word for depart used in Philemon, what it's talking about is departure from responsibilities, departure from a covenant that was made, departure from an agreement where they were no longer fulfilling the terms of the agreement they had. That's what's being looked at in Philemon. And finally, in Hebrews chapter 7, it talks about Christ. It talks about him being separate from sinners. That's the word, therefore, depart, that we find in 1 Corinthians 7. What does it mean when it says Christ was made separate from sinners? Okay, you got to keep in mind, the Lord Jesus Christ lived on this earth right in the midst of sinners. So it's not talking about a positional separation where he was not at the same location sinners were. It's just the opposite. Christ came and lived with sinners here on earth. When it talks about Christ being separate from sinners, the idea was he himself was not a sinner. Even though he was born into this sinful world, even though he lived among sinful people because Christ was God himself, and because Christ was virgin born, Christ did not have a sin nature. He was separate from sinners. He was different from sinners. So there again you can see that Greek word it doesn't involve location or position at all. It's not saying that he was located at a different place than sinners were. It's not saying that at all. By the term departure, or the idea of being separate from sinners, it's talking about the idea he was different from sinners. It has nothing to do with physical location. Okay. As we can see in these different examples that I've given you, the Greek word that's translated departure, first of all, we find what? It always involves some type of separation. Whether it's separating the two persons that are a part of a marital covenant, to separating from a physical location, to being separated from love, or to be separated from the responsibilities we've been given, or to be separated from sinners, even though in the midst of them. However you look at it, the idea is separation. It's the idea of there being some type of a separation involved. Okay? But remember, I gave us a list of 6 different times that this word is used in the New Testament, or 6 different contexts in which it's used. Of those 6, only one involved a locational separation, or a departure from one location to go to another. Only one time did it mean that. All the other times it meant some other type of separation. That's important when we get here to 1 Corinthians chapter 7. In 1 Corinthians chapter 7, there's many people who would say, when it talks about a spouse departing from a spouse, that must be a physical desertion from the marriage. They say it has to be departing from one location to another. In other words, for there to be scriptural grounds for divorce, a spouse has to literally run off, where he leaves the home. He no longer is living under the same roof as the person he's married to. He totally runs off to some other physical location. There are some people that believe that's what's being talked about by this term, depart. Well, we can see the New Testament doesn't use that word exclusively to mean running off from a location. It means a separation. There are some people who say, well, the word depart here means divorce. And what's being said is this: by one person departing from another, it means they get a divorce from their spouse. And so what's being said is this: if a person divorces you, and if you're not guilty, if they're the ones that are the guilty party in the divorce, you're free. Well, that could be a meaning to this. Just like them running away physically to another location, that could be a meaning. But it doesn't have to be. When we looked at these different verses, how that word was used in the New Testament, keep in mind, only twice out of 6 times did the word mean a divorce in a marriage. Okay, so what are we talking about? When we look at the idea of a spouse departing, here's what I believe it means. When a spouse separates themselves from the marriage agreement, that is biblical grounds for divorce. Now, that can happen in several ways. The person can literally, physically run off to another location where they no longer have any type of contact with their former spouse, or from their spouse. They no longer have any contact. They no longer have any interaction. They no longer have any intimacy with the person they married. They physically run off. Well, what are they doing? They're separating themselves from the covenant responsibilities they were given, just like in Philemon. Onesimus separated himself from the responsibilities that he had toward Philemon. So one way a spouse can separate themselves from the responsibility of their marital covenant is by literally running off to another location. But there's more ways than that. A spouse can divorce another spouse, and in that way run away, separate themselves from the marital covenant. So if you have two people that are married, one person, for whatever reason, decides, I'm tired. Let's say he just decides he's tired of the marriage. He just doesn't want to be married anymore, so he divorces the person. Sometimes that's called a no-fault divorce. There are some states now that allow that. In that case, where the spouse that is being divorced has done nothing wrong, their mate simply chooses that they don't want to be married anymore. When that takes place is when they divorce that spouse. The spouse that did no wrong, according to Paul, I believe, they're free. They're no longer under the bondage of that marital agreement. And they're free to remarry. Why? Because the one they were married to separated themselves from the marital covenant. In that instance, how did they do it? By a decree of divorce. There's even another way that people can separate themselves from their marital covenant. They can live under the same roof. They just don't keep the promises they made to their spouse. I mean, think about what there's several different promises we make. And again, for lack of time, I can't go into all of them, but some of it is to support one another, to love one another, to care for one another, to be intimate with one another. You have somebody who just says, look, we're going to live under the same roof, but I'm not going to love you. I'm not going to take care of you. I'm not going to be intimate with you. It's just like we're two strangers living under the same roof. If that continues on habitually, if that continues on unrepentantly, that person is separating themselves from their marital covenant. That's what I believe the idea of depart here means in 1 Corinthians. And you can see where I'm getting that from. It's from the different ways that word for depart is used in the New Testament. If you study how it's used, you come up with a clear understanding of what the idea of depart means. It means to put separation between that person and their marital covenant. And again, I talked about at least 3 ways that can be done. By departing to a different physical location where you no longer care or love or are intimate with your spouse. By actually divorcing them for no grounds. I just don't want to be married. I'm going to divorce him. That's running away from the agreement you made. That's no longer fulfilling the agreement. That's departing from the agreement, being separated from the agreement. Or, as I said before, just choosing not to fulfill the agreement. Yeah, you live under the same roof. You don't actually get a divorce, but you just don't fulfill your part of the marital covenant. What you promised your spouse, you just don't fulfill. Habitually, unrepentantly, you continue on and continue on and continue on, just not being a spouse. That's another way you can depart or separate yourself from the marital contract that's been made. You know what's so sad? Some people think they can do those type of things without anything coming back upon them. But remember what I said in the beginning. God's the witness to that marital agreement. When those two people were married, God witnessed the fact the man promised the wife and the wife promised the man. When someone takes it upon themselves to depart from their marital agreement, to separate themselves from the responsibilities of their marital agreement, God is a witness to all that. He saw them make the promise, and He is seeing them break their promise. There will be a punishment involved when someone walks away from the terms of a covenant when they break their own word that they made, when they break a promise they made, especially when it comes to marriage. Remember, God made man one flesh. The marriage union brought those two together as if they were one flesh. The only reason why the Lord even allows divorce is because of the hardness of man's heart. Because he knew there were going to be people who, because of their sin natures, would be rebellious to that covenant. They wouldn't keep their side of the covenant. In that case, they're abusing their spouse, and the Lord is allowing divorce for the protection of the innocent spouse. So they cannot, or so they don't have to, be constantly living under an abusive spouse who refuses to keep their marital covenant. That's the way I believe we need to look at 1 Corinthians 7 when it comes to departure. It is a spouse departing from their marital covenant. Again, that can happen in many ways, but the point is, when a spouse does depart from their marital covenant, the remaining spouse, the one who did not depart from the responsibilities of their covenant, they're then free to divorce, and they are free to remarry because their spouse has departed from that marital covenant that they had previously made with them. I want to thank you very much for spending this time in the Word. May the Lord bless you as you study His Word.